everyone, how are you? Welcome back to my channel, or if you're new here, welcome for the first time. Today, we are going to cover the anti-trans sentiment in Connecticut yet again because it's continuing to be a growing problem in this state, and it's left me worried about the safety of its LGBT+ population. That hate hasn't been left unchecked because the hands-off protests that took place throughout April and a celebration held in Hartford in honor of International Transgender Day of Visibility has given me hope that people living in Connecticut care about safeguarding their schools from those trying to dismantle the reason why education is the most important thing. Additionally, the state government is considering new legislation that protects LGBT+ students as well as the community as a whole from discrimination and banned books. At the beginning of the year, the proposed bills have been met with some opposition, mostly from medical professionals, and I use the word loosely, that have no idea what they're talking about, a college graduate that weaponized his detransition story in an attempt to dissuade the Judiciary Committee from classifying gender identity and expression as a protected group in accordance to SB 1380, and a few individuals affiliated with parental rights groups. Along with TERFs, I have a prolonged war with the latter, and my anger grew when I discovered that right-wing local news outlets like the Connecticut Centinal is platforming them. It's not to argue that parents shouldn't have a say in their child's education because they have their best interests at heart, and no parent or guardian wants their kid in harm's way. That I can sympathize with, but when specific student/learning materials are targeted to keep a few prudish grown-ups complacent, enforcing parental rights starts to be like herding cats. If one or two parents get their way, another family is going to come out seething, putting the school district and its students in a no-win situation. In an environment where kids from different backgrounds go to get their education, a let parents parent initiative is inconvenient at the end of the day. I don't see how forcing teachers and doctors out of their jobs through harassment campaigns coupled with demonizing the trans community just for existing is keeping kids safe. Chris Barrett's reason for opposing SB 1380 seems like it'll encourage bullying toward their marginalized classmates, since the fib that no child is born in the wrong body makes removing humanity from them easier than playing hopscotch. Christine Rebstock is one parental rights advocate that hasn't received that memo. For those watching that aren't aware of who she is a recurring guest on right-leaning podcasts and radio shows across the state and parts of New York. There she would promote harmful misinformation on sex education, diversity, equity, and inclusion, as well as gender-affirming care. The last time I covered Christine, she was featured on Connecticut Valley Views a third time, where she instills the idea that kids in supportive, inclusive environments such as their schools are being brainwashed by the quote-unquote rainbow mafia. This video earned me a personalized response from Christine, where she claims I did what she called a hatchet job to deflect from having written a couple of them herself that the Connecticut Mirror published. As predictable as it was, I was admittedly taken aback because at the time she posted about me, she was running for state representative against incumbent Brandon Chaffee in Connecticut's 33rd House District. I'm glad that Brandon won his re-election bid, not just because he's a more likable politician that's passionate about fighting global warming and reforming Connecticut's healthcare system, but imagine if Christine actually did win. If Elon Musk is bold enough to exploit his position as the president's senior advisor to dox Judge John McConnell's daughter, it's hard to anticipate what a candidate with that much time on her hands would do with that power. I don't trust that kind of person with the responsibilities that comes with representing a state district, and that's a belief I'll stand by whenever I decide who I'm voting for in an election. Regardless, I couldn't help but get a chuckle out of the poor grammar in Christine's response. It made the post so senseless and all over the place that I got over my discomfort. Anyway, now that I mentioned that level of stupidity, I came across a recent post on Christine's campaign page on Facebook where she shared a link to a lengthy blurb she had posted on Truth Social. That post contained a link to a horribly written article the Connecticut Centinal published about the Trans Day of Visibility event. Until I checked out what Christine had to say, I avoided Truth Social for the sake of my sanity, but decided to make an exception, since that was where I found the article, and it wasn't hard to understand right off the bat that the truth is clearly a lie. Ironic, isn't it? Truth Social is a Twitter knockoff that President Trump established in response to getting suspended from Twitter and Facebook for his alleged role in instigating the insurrection at the U.S. Capitol building in January 2021. These suspensions were since lifted, but President Trump continues to post on Truth Social so he can put out any misleading statement or implied threats of violence he desires without getting fact-checked or risk getting suspended again. Sadly, since Meta has permitted users to address the LGBT+ community as mentally ill, it seems like a pipe dream at this point. A bulk of his supporters, including conspiracy theorists, homophobes, and incels, join Truth Social to escape scrutiny they normally face on Meta, Reddit, and Blue Sky. Their posts pile up to create a junkyard that's unnecessary to rummage through for the topic at hand and add to a list of reasons to lose faith in our nation's democracy. But regardless, it's where this rabbit hole led me to this time around, so let's continue with examining Christine's post. Her post states, the Trans Day of Visibility ceremony at the state's capital and the ensuing article by the Connecticut Centinal left a lot to be desired. Let's see about that. And of course, she disabled comments on that post. Not allowing open discussion in a post is often never a good sign in my book. I'm aware that a handful of public figures disable comments for reasons other than blocking out criticism. Granted, some I follow that disable comments on all of their posts do so because trying to keep up with them is overwhelming and they want to maintain their privacy. But if it's a controversial former political candidate like Christine Rebstock that posted an unflattering recount of their attendance at a trans visibility event, that could mean she is trying to avoid feedback that might contest her side of the story. Two wrongs don't make a right. Yeah, sure they don't. 1. The Trans Day of Visibility ceremony was flawed as they left out the only trans person to run for a Connecticut state legislative seat, me. As it turned out, it was a good thing as the parade of trans rights activists were rude to me all day, and that's putting it kindly. We're 3 sentences in, and my empathy for Christine is at an all-time low. If not being a part of the ceremony ruined it for you, that sounds like a you problem, to be honest. I have a lot to say about that sentence because Christine leaves out so much context that her attempt to play the victim card would have been believable if this part of her post was taken at face value. The fact Christine got told off at a Trans Day of Visibility event was nothing new. She's not well liked outside of social media since a handful of people that have encountered her have expressed their anger on Reddit that she is willing to overstep boundaries of morality to appeal to politicians, working with President Trump to deprive the trans community of basic rights. Their persistence has taken a step further when the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, led by Robert F. Kennedy, aka Mr. I Don't Believe in Vaccines, announced they are planning to erase gender dysphoria from the list of disabilities protected by the government. This could hinder students and young adults struggling with their gender identities from seeking guidance and support from medical professionals. They'd legally be turned away for revealing their body doesn't match their gender. If that were to happen nationwide, the HHS will soon go after the autism spectrum, Down syndrome, and personality disorders next. An ongoing Republican-led lawsuit that is set to remove protections granted by federal law to neurodivergent individuals is proof that they aren't going to stop at the trans community. I don't condone the use of inflammatory language at an occasion that's family-friendly, but I understand why Christine may have been left out of the ceremony. Her claim that she should be honored as a former candidate for state representative, knowing what her goals were if elected, is obtuse, especially since one was to propose gutting state funding to Planned Parenthood and excluding trans students from competing in sports in the name of quote-unquote protecting girls. Do you want to know a secret? It doesn't. Do you know why? These restrictions are another excuse to dictate what a woman can and can't do, or how a woman should and shouldn't look. It happened to Danny Davis, a cisgender female Walmart employee that lost her job because a hypersensitive man had followed her into the ladies' room. The company later offered Danny to return with back pay after an internal investigation, but she refused. She said that she thought it was a hostile environment to go back to, and frankly, I don't blame her. Walmart got rid of its DEI initiatives within weeks into the new presidency. Therefore, Danny's safety would not be guaranteed if this incident reoccurred. Savvy Leeser, a Chicago-based entrepreneur and book reviewer I'm acquainted with on Instagram, did an excellent job under 2 stories she posted back in February where she explained the outrage over the federal government pushing to regulate women's bodies when the hypocrisy of it all is that our current commander-in-chief is a pervert. Her fears are not unfounded because statistically, women are feeling less safe around cisgender men because they've become increasingly aggressive and entitled when they're told no. It's the reason why more women prefer to take their chances with a bear than they would with a man if they're alone in a forest. Many women have more positive views about the trans community than they would about men whose intentions are less than trustworthy because very few trans individuals are predatory. Savvy also used a caption from the New York Times that Matt used in his post that she shared to highlight the hidden implications of excluding transgender athletes from sports teams, which first of all, only make up a tiny percentage that the federal government singled out, opening them up to ridicule and discrimination. Second of all, it affects cis people whose qualities stray from gender norms like a woman with a French crop haircut, a man wearing nail polish, and neurodivergent people. I talked about before how someone thought I was a woman while I was showering in the men's locker room at a YMCA because my voice is higher than most men. It may have seemed like a tiny misunderstanding, but based on Danny's termination, it could have and would have escalated even if I said I'm obviously a dude. Since Christine was met with hostility at the Trans Day of Visibility event, it's possible that she may have said something off-color that provoked the attendees, or some of them recognized her from a promotion of ideals that can lead restrooms to become far more dangerous. It may have been a combination of both factors because most people present at a normally inclusive event don't just look at you and tell you to scram. Christine had to have been out of line in order for her to have had that reaction. In other words, if you don't want to be berated for being a chauvinist, then simply don't be one. 2. I have the utmost respect for the Connecticut Centinal as they are a valued news source unlike the state-run media. But they missed the mark and their bigotry showed big time by the gender-critical bigot who wrote this piece. It's hysterical that it took an openly transphobic article for an avid reader of an alt-right news outlet they trusted to be a quote-unquote valued news source to second-guess its credibility as if it wasn't prejudiced multiple times before. And even more so, I get most of my news from private and public broadcast corporations, none of which are state-owned, but I digress. I never saw the Connecticut Centinal as a valued news source because it is a garbage publication that is akin to a tabloid. It is dependent on clickbait to the extent where they can't use words like consternation as a buzzword in an article claiming that a billionaire had hired random people to protest in major cities and not expect readers to react harshly when that has not been proven to be factual in the slightest. Realistically, no billionaire can afford to cut millions of protesters a check. They were out on the streets at their own volition because they care about their constitutional rights. Nonetheless, the Connecticut Centinal's articles are skewed to portray left-leaning politicians, activists, and ordinary individuals that disagree with them as deranged nutcases. It scarcely covers sensitive issues from a 360-degree perspective, something that Connecticut Valley Views has been slacking in lately as well. To be fair, this occurs in journalism more often than not, but the Connecticut Centinal purposely does this to draw in viewers and use their anger as a selling point to reel them in like fish on a hook. Dawn Innes, whom right before speaking told me to stay the fuck away from me before she spoke, was misgendered just like everyone else mentioned in the article, including a trans boy being a girl who thinks she's a boy is rude and uncalled for. This run-on sentence made it hard for me to understand at first glance if Christine was referring to Dawn specifically, or if she's calling out the article for describing a trans boy as a girl that thinks she's a boy, which is an absolutely disgusting thing to say about a child. These details really should be separated into two clauses if Christine's intent was to communicate her frustration with both the event and the article in a way that gets that message across concisely. Another issue I have with this sentence, however, is that if Christine was trying to state that Dawn was being rude for telling her to back off, then that comes across as selfish. I'm sorry, a journalist that teaches PR and media literacy at a college level is not interested in putting up with someone that thinks Donald Trump's executive orders, specifically targeting the trans community, were reasonable. Men are men, trans men are trans men, and women are women. Trans women are trans women.
Here we go again.
It's that simple, but both trans rights activists and gender-critical bigots don't want to believe it. I don't want to believe it because I explained twice that science has proven that biological sex and gender aren't the same thing. I use someone's pronouns and gender identity in a conversation with that person to be courteous to them, something gender-critical bigots like J.K. Rowling would rather skip in favor of jail time. Don't look at me, these were her own words. Christine's viewpoints are similar to hers, if not close by a hair strand. She doesn't just invalidate the identities of transgender and non-binary individuals, but she point-blank echoes the fib that learning environments that accept trans kids are abusing them when she spoke about restricting inclusive books from school libraries at a couple meetings at the Connecticut Department of Education that were held in February and November 2023.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Christine Rebstock, a transsexual woman from Middletown. I'm here to speak out against social emotional learning, which introduces sex and gender issues, particularly in the elementary and junior high schools. While it sounds good on paper, this is actually hurting our children. Many kids will be thinking that being trans is cool or is a fad. That's far from the truth. Living with gender dysphoria is absolutely brutal. Another problem we've seen is kids are being administered medications such as puberty blockers, which are not reversible, hormone replacement therapy, and even gender-altering surgeries. This is wrong. It's child abuse. And if people think I'm anti-trans kid, anti-LGBT kid, you're wrong. I really want to help them. These issues have to emanate from the home and involves no medical transition to their legally age of 18 with consent. In the meantime, can we tell the truth to kids? We're hearing a lot about pronouns and non-binary. The truth of the matter is that you were born male, you were born female, and some few, because of medical quirks, were born intersex with both reproductive parts. We were not assigned sex at birth. Granted, in Connecticut, you could put an X on your driver's license, and you could put an X on your passport. There's only two genders, not 3, not 53, so there's no need for this pronoun stuff. Please, let's let the kids know that. And we don't need a curriculum to tell kids, everybody's different, let's be kind and be respectful to each other. Thank you very much.
Oh, hi, are you Billiam's mom? Yes, I'm glad you finally found time to meet with me. I have some serious concerns about my son, Billiam. Oh, well, he's doing really well. Hold on. We were working on his language arts homework and I noticed he was learning about pronouns. Yes, we're moving into grammar this week. Don't you think that's inappropriate? I don't understand. My little Billiam is way too young to be learning about such things. Well, he's about to go to middle school. This is just basic grammar. Hold on, I'm texting his father. I don't understand why these schools seem to be so progressive nowadays. When I was in school, we learned about education and I turned out fine. Okay, well, you definitely learned about pronouns in school. Well, back in the day, we used to learn by reading directly out of a dictionary. So where are you getting this outlandish curriculum? So you're telling me you don't know what pronouns are? Of course I know what pronouns are. All the parents are talking about it and it's inappropriate for the classroom. Should I also stop teaching verbs and adjectives? As long as the verb is appropriate. Out.
This speech contains 29 pronouns, based on the argument that There's no need for this pronoun stuff in schools with that hanging over our heads. Does that mean the dictionary will be age-restricted next? Is language arts too woke to be taught in classes now? Good grief. Christine has my confidence that trans kids are good without her help, or lack thereof for that matter, because of the non-binary erasure and overt support for medical gatekeeping in that speech. Also, funny she should bring up that there's no need for topics in classes that teaches kids that everyone's different, because that's what helps them learn to be kind and respectful to each other. It worked wonders when I went on field trips to the Connecticut Museum of Culture and History as a 3rd or 4th grader. Before you try to desensitize me into thinking that there's nothing disgusting and imbecilic about Christine's speech, visualize this scenario. Have you ever waited in line at a register only to be held up by a person in front of you bickering with a cashier and or their supervisor insisting that a product is on sale when it actually isn't? She'd say several times, "I'm not being a pain," before continuing to give the cashier a hard time by insisting the sale applies to that product. True story. Likewise, if you have the audacity to say you don't hate trans kids before and after proceeding to propose segregating them from their peers in sports games, restrict them from accessing life-saving medical care, and prevent them from eventually obtaining documentation that corresponds with their gender identities, then I have to ask, are you sure? Because it sounds like you're lying to yourself. Declaring that there are only 2 genders in a classroom environment could lead children whose appearances and personalities stray from societal norms to be singled out and bullied by peers that grew up in conservative households. Biologists have found from studying the genetic makeup of intersex individuals that gender exists on a broader spectrum than just male and female, and while it is overwhelming to grasp, the reason more kids feel comfortable coming out as gay, transgender, or both is that their schools lately are accepting of individuals in these demographics, sometimes more so than their own homes, heaven forbid, blackmailing teachers into dropping gender issues from their lesson plans and failing to address sexism in the education system in the process is not what I'd call helping LGBT+ students.
Everybody, happy November. I'm Christine Rebstock, Middletown. I'm also the Executive Director of Media and Communications for LGBTS United. We have a go-live date of December 1st, so fingers crossed. There's a book that's been found in our Connecticut school libraries and children's sections of public libraries. I'd like to read an excerpt or two. It's also been a recommended reading list. The name of the book is called Gender Queer, and I have a random page here. It has some graphic details to it. It is a illustrated book. Target age is 12 to 18. We have a child here. When I was 11 or 12, the first time I can remember fantasizing about having a penis, I was lying fully clothed on a hillside under an open sky. I held an open, folded handful of grass between my legs, safe in the knowledge that if discovered, I could release my imaginary member and would disintegrate back into scattered stalks. For years, my standard method of masturbation was stuffing a sock into the front of my pants and manipulating the bulge. This would resolve into hip thrusting while thinking of my latest gay ship. A little sexual innuendo. Memorably, I got off once while driving. I just rubbed in the front of my jeans and imagined getting a blowjob. So this is in our education system. To me, this is age inappropriate for our children, and I just want to bring that to your attention. We also seen some of Connecticut's worst. 10 days ago in Avon, Connecticut, at the Moms for Liberty Harford County Symposium, titled Parental Rights, What's the Controversy? I was asked to be one of the panelists that day with James Lindsay as the featured speaker. What greeted us was hatred by protesters holding Stop the Hate signs, Love Wins, Stop Banning Books. The truth of the matter was, in that symposium, there was no mention of books to be banned. None at all. We're just calling for age-appropriate books, and no book by name was listed or anyone brought up either. And the Avon Democrats on their Facebook page said, we don't want a hateful extremist group of racist, transphobes, and homophobes. Well, James Lindsay, the featured speaker, didn't touch on any of that. He mentioned what you would call transgenderism, which I alluded to later in my speech. It wasn't transphobic.
Let's have a brief look at my video from back in October before I talk about why I disagree with Christine's second speech. I made a bet with myself that she'd read a specific part from Genderqueer that parental rights advocates are obsessed with, and I want to see if it is the passage that I predicted it was. You're not fooling anyone, Christine. Book bans were not explicitly brought up at the forum because the event was scrutinized by the protesters outside. Panelists in Avon are aware that any discussion about it will cause tensions between Moms for Liberty and their critics to escalate. Not to the point of violence, hopefully not, but to the point where they'll say, you know what? Get out of our town. We're not letting you anywhere near our schools. These sectarians are counting on their votes to claim control of the curriculum so they can't risk making enemies with the communities they're appealing to. That's how they lost ground in several school districts in Florida and the reason much of suburban Connecticut hates them. A proposal to restrict access to challenged books is easier to approve because then it tricks voters into believing they'll still be available, save for the extra hurdle that students would have to jump through. I'd be cutting corners if I said there was nothing to get worked up about because parents can always just ask for a restricted book on behalf of their child if they're interested, but I don't trust a parental rights group when they state they don't want books banned, and certainly not after a Moms for Liberty chapter quoted Adolf Hitler in a newsletter. When it came to power, Germany's education system was drastically altered, and a research facility devoted to sexology and advocacy for queer and trans rights was ransacked by young Nazi sympathizers, and over 20,000 books were burned later in the streets. Nowadays, in the education system, the challenged book eventually disappears quietly from schools and public libraries, and no one would think to look for it. The author of the book in question, Maya Kobabe, stated in their interview with Dan Coys on Slate that Genderqueer, a coming-of-age memoir about their decision to identify as non-binary, is not for younger audiences to read, so Christine was preaching to the choir at the school board meeting. She only read one page from the book and declared it was not age-appropriate without looking into what the book is about. Failing to read more than the first chapter, or page for that matter, is a common deficiency and cause to ban or restrict books that touch on queer and gender identity. Maya touches on this point when they mention that they only included sexually explicit material that they thought were significant to the story they wanted to tell in their memoir. Maya sparingly talked about their experiences with masturbation and their use of a sex toy because they were keeping it focused on how they helped them think about their gender identity. We do not know the number of the page Christine Rebstock read at that board meeting, but I'd wager it is that part. I called it. Pay up. Thank you. Besides the fact that this speech was irritating to listen to because the microphone was too loud, Christine had been hasty to conclude that school libraries shouldn't have Genderqueer on their shelves based on a sexually explicit topic that was brought up sparingly. The book's author, Maya Kobabe, stated in an interview she did with Slate about Genderqueer that it is not for young kids to read anyway, making this proposal frivolous and unnecessary in comparison to, I don't know, students not being able to afford lunch so billionaires in the country can get wealthier from tax breaks. I don't buy Christine's claim that James Lindsay touching on the trans community is not transphobic, and neither did the protesters that day. By insisting on that, let alone using the term transgenderism to refer to trans people to begin with, she made it apparent that she's out of touch with the families and community members that showed up to the senior center to condemn the Moms for Liberty forum. She turns the tables and states that these protesters were being hateful. However, she does not understand why they were angry that the meeting had taken place. It's a dangerously misleading claim that depicts them as criminals and scares ordinary people out of standing up to oppression in their everyday lives. That's how tyrants acquire more and more power unopposed. The recording of Christine's second speech abruptly ends after that sentence, but there's no way Moms for Liberty had good intentions by inviting James Lindsay to the forum based on his status as a white supremacist and disparaging comments about the LGBT+ community. He is well known for promoting the Great Replacement conspiracy by preying on concerned parents. Like Connecticut Valley View's hostess Susan Regan, he uses their fears of their children being indoctrinated to convince them to demand public schools to remove lessons covering systematic racism from classes. James believes that getting rid of that subject would somehow foil a communist revolution that would overthrow the U.S. government. Luckily, the protesters in Avon weren't easily fooled by his persuasive tactics, and that resistance has since been living rent-free in Christine's noggin. Carly Webb, another trans rights activist who blocked me on social media like Dawn and accused me of wanting transgender people dead, doesn't play football with the Connecticut ambush anymore, as the league complied with the president's EO about banning trans women from women's sports. Many sports organizations, including the NCAA, did so as well. Whoever wrote this article didn't do their homework on this. Neither did you, since nothing you said in your speeches and guest appearances proved Carly's accusation against you as false, but whatever excuse floats your boat. The Connecticut Interscholastic Athletic Conference didn't change its policy simply because they don't want to. It's not just because they didn't want to, it's such an oversimplified explanation that it overlooks the elephant in the room. The reason the association didn't change its rules is because excluding trans women from playing in women's sports is discrimination. Janet Mills, the governor of Maine, would think so too. She stood her ground against President Trump when he held federal funding for the state school lunch programs hostage to coerce her to go along with his executive order banning transgender athletes from competing in sports teams. Guess how she responded?
But I understand Maine. Is Maine here, the governor of Maine? Well, are you not going to comply with it?
I'm complying with state and federal laws.
We are the federal law. Well, you better do it. You better do it because you're not going to get any federal funding at all if you don't. And by the way, your population, even though it's somewhat liberal, although I did very well there, your population doesn't want men playing in women's sports. So you better comply because otherwise you're not getting any federal funding.
See you in court.
Every state, good, I'll see you in court. I look forward to that. That should be a real easy one. And enjoy your life after governor, because I don't think you'll be in elected politics.
The joke's on you, Donald. A federal court sided with her and she won. As part of a settlement from the case, the U.S. Department of Agriculture agreed for the time being to leave funding for Maine's nutrition programs out of this squabble. I refer to it as such because the Maine Principals Association stated that only 2 transgender athletes are involved with girls' sports this school year. This strengthens Savvy's claim in her Instagram story that there shouldn't be a debate about this at all. It proves that nothing can be used to persuade supportive school officials to leave the kids alone than threatening to starve them. Not very Christian of them now, is it? There'd still be some obstacles for trans athletes to navigate before they're at a good point in their transitioning where they can join a team that corresponds with their gender identities. But being transgender does not give them an edge over their cisgender opponents, as reported by the Canadian Centre for Ethics in Sport, and seconded by the British Journal of Sports Medicine. Excluding them would get the Connecticut Interscholastic Athletic Conference's pantsuit off if they approved of Christine's incredibly harmful, misogynistic proposal. It's partly why Bob Stefanowski ran for governor in 2022. He planned to propose a similar bill that would make that legal, putting a stop to these potential lawsuits as a result. And speaking of, now would be a good time to sound the alarm that Connecticut's gubernatorial election is next year, so if you're from my home state and you're watching this, get ready to fight that battle again. I wrote a rules proposal to protect girls' sports, but Glenn Longarini, the executive director of the Connecticut Interscholastic Athletic Conference, rebuffed my proposal. Here comes another run-on sentence. The Connecticut Legislative Office Building in March of 2024, and legislators who expressed interest meeting with me about this haven't contacted me yet. Later that month, Christine got her wish by meeting with State Representative Tom O'D to discuss their shared mission. He was vocal about seeing it through in the form of an amendment he introduced during a debate last February. It would allow the Education Commissioner to pressure the Connecticut Interscholastic Athletic Conference to undertake guidelines for complying with the executive order that was legally contested in Maine. Foolish minds definitely think alike in this instance. It's not likely it'll get far in a state government where the Democratic Party holds the majority, but next year's gubernatorial election could drastically change that if we're not mindful. Sadly, Connecticut is already veering towards being placed in a similar position. The only reason Tom O'D introduced that amendment and agreed to meet with Christine Rebstock about her proposal is because he's terrified that Connecticut may lose federal funding, despite the fact Maine stood its ground and kept it. At times, I feel like I'm the only person in America that can bring common sense to trans issues. One reason why I ran for state representative. But gender-critical bigots and trans rights activists are two sides of the same coin and have no interest in hearing common-sense solutions. Then she leaves a link to the article that the Connecticut Centinal published about the Trans Day of Visibility event in Hartford. Christine stated in her speech at the Connecticut Department of Education back in February 2023 that she wants to help trans kids, yet as I established, she's out there isolating students from their supportive authority figures, cutting them off from medical resources that can navigate them through puberty, and then disguising it as common sense. Gender-critical bigots also believe that it is. They don't want to coexist with the trans community because they continue to see them as a danger to women and children, a sentiment that Christine shares with them, so she shouldn't act like a victim if she turns up at a LGBT+ event and she encounters attendees that tell her, "We don't want you here." And she's calling me unhinged? If anything, Christine's post on Truth Social about the Trans Day of Visibility event is a bigger hit piece because putting gender-critical bigots and trans rights activists in the same bracket is a silly, nonsensical point to raise. I don't have any empathy for her because the more I read her post, the more it resembles a Yelp review a customer wrote about a restaurant because they didn't get the service they wanted. She hasn't helped her own arguments.
What is going on here? Came by to check out the club, but this is a gay club. Hey, that's cool with me, honey. I don't mind watching. We do though. So I can stay and hang out? Not if you're gonna walk around with that on your head. Why does that matter? I thought you people were tolerant of everybody. Who told you that? Isn't that what you're fighting for? Loving whoever you want? Why would we love and support people that are trying to take our rights away? Hello? Hold up now. I don't have a problem with you people. It's the sin I got a problem with, and I can't get past that. But I don't mind being around you people. Yikes, that's kind of traumatizing for people if you're coming up in our environment saying that. So, no, we're not going to have you here. That's discrimination, because no one's ever discriminated against gay people to the point where they need their own club to stay the fuck away from you. Oh, so you want to fight fire with fire? That ain't gonna solve your problem. I'm not trying to solve a problem, I just want you out of our space. This is making y'all look bad. No, I think it looks bad when you vote against people's rights and then try to go into their space and wonder why they don't want to be around you. Oh gee, so now clubs are political? Y'all people can't do anything without making it political. You chose to wear a MAGA hat to a gay club. What are you doing? I should be able to express my opinion anywhere I go because it's America. Oh my god, same. And I think you really should get the fuck out.
Okay, let's see how bad this article is. Connecticut Lieutenant Governor Bisowich celebrated Transgender Day of Visibility in Hartford on Monday with a bunch of activists. It's an awfully juvenile headline for an article published by an outlet that seems to pride itself on investigative journalism. Trans activists want to pass a long list of bills this session, from enshrining gender identity into the state constitution to removing parental rights. Oh boy, they're panicking and I'm here for it. Lieutenant Governor Susan Bisowich held a press conference to celebrate and honor Transgender Day of Visibility on Monday in Hartford, and to let quote-unquote all people know that they are welcome in Connecticut. It's great that the Lieutenant Governor used her speech at the event to remind the attendees that everyone from different backgrounds and walks of life are welcome in Connecticut. So why does the Centennial have an issue with her promoting tolerance and acceptance? The air quotes when it mentioned all people rubbed me the wrong way, and when I scrolled down, I found out why I had that feeling. Christine wasn't kidding apparently. The article misgendered every single trans activist that came to speak at the Trans Day of Visibility event. This is unacceptable behavior. I corrected the pronouns in the screenshots I've taken so the way these trans activists are addressed from my mouth aligns with their gender identity. I know I'm just reading the article and these are the journalist's words and not mine, but I want to make a practice out of discouraging this behavior by showing these people the respect they deserve. Lieutenant Governor Bicewicz used the event to quote-unquote amplify some incredibly strong trans voices in the community. Again, I don't like how they're using air quotes to refer to trans individuals and issues. It's disgusting. Like trans teen activist June Carpenter from the Out Accountability Project who celebrated trans joy, even though she said, trans lives are rooted in struggle and hardship. That's true. She said trans joy, for instance, can be obtained when you see yourself represented in a book for the very first time. She feels euphoria when she's been seen and described feeling trans happiness much like an act of revolution, asserting that trans joy is unstoppable. Next up was Dawn Ines from West Hartford Pride, who says she has been trans her whole life and is the proud single mama of 3 proud queer kids, including one who is trans. What are the odds of that? The journalist talks about Dawn and her children as if they are animals performing in a circus, even if the article is written as an opinion piece, asking what are the odds of Dawn having 3 queer kids, as if they are covering the kind of carnival portrayed in a series of unfortunate events, is completely dehumanizing and unprofessional. It comes off as reiterating that being queer is a quality that should be perceived as weird and unnatural. Fun fact, same-sex relationships in some shape or form have been documented in over 1,500 animals, including penguins and lions. We're the only species that thinks that young students learning about it is quote-unquote indoctrinating them. It shows that we're more driven by hate toward the LGBT plus community than by actually protecting students.
I get comments like this quite a lot on my videos. But I want you to remember, at one point in time, this was considered indoctrination. A white guy and a black guy sitting in a swimming pool. This was incredibly controversial. Because at the time, there were white-only swimming pools, so Mr. Rogers invited his friend, Officer Clemens, to come sit in his swimming pool with him. To demonstrate to children that it is okay to be kind to one another, even to those who do not look like you. So when I'm in my classroom, and I put on nail polish to demonstrate to my students that I am still the same person. That's all I'm doing. Demonstrating that you can be kind to people who do not look like you. I do not want your children to be gay. I do not want your children to be straight. I want your children to be happy and to be kind to one another. Would be cool too. So.
Besides being a journalist, Ines is a college professor at the University of Hartford teaching journalism, advertising, public relations, podcasting, and media literacy. Ines seems to want to scare everyone that trans people are going to lose their freedom under the Trump administration. If that is what you wish to believe, go ahead, but riddle me this. Why did the State Department's website remove the letters TQIA+ from its advisory page for queer individuals traveling overseas? Why is President Trump banning trans individuals from serving in the military with the Supreme Court backing him up? And why might gender dysphoria no longer be classified as a disability by the Department of Health and Human Services? Dawn was very well justified to claim that the trans community living in the U.S. are losing their rights step by step. But if you think they have nothing to worry about, why is the federal government actively dismantling their acknowledgement of them? Tell me. Ines called on a friend to come to take the mic, a trans activist, an assigned male at birth, and journalist named Carly Chardonnay Webb, who also happens to play for Connecticut Ambush Football, an all quote-unquote female tackle football league. And of course, Webb sees no problem with men playing in women's sports, and even joked on Instagram about the women's tackle football game where she tackled another dude. That's what women's sports has become in Connecticut, a joke. This whole article is a joke. I mean, it was published on April Fool's, so I saw that coming. State Representative M.J. Shannon, a member of the LGBTQ+ caucus, promised that transgender people are going to be at the center of policymaking in the state because visibility isn't just about being seen, it's about being respected, protected, and valued in every space, whether it's our schools, our workplaces, our healthcare systems, our homes. Good for him! He may have been elected into the state's House of Representatives at a young age, but he's shown the attendees from his speech that he has what it takes to serve them. That's the kind of integrity I look for in an elected official. He seemed upset about efforts to keep men assigned at birth out of girls' sports and wants to fight to protect that right for trans people. Translation, he doesn't care about protecting cisgender girls, so instead he's fighting for quote-unquote true inclusion and justice for the TQ+ community. The following couple of paragraphs beg to differ. Other elected officials joined the event as well, including State Representative Moira Rotter, who represented liberal white women allies to the transgender community, and New Haven Alderman Devin Absalom Smith, the first trans official elected in Connecticut. Byziewicz gave a shout-out to other LGBTQ+ allies in the state house, including State Representatives Sarah Keat, Lucy Dathan, Christian McCarthy-Vahey, Kate Farrar, and Lori Sweet. Byziewicz also invited a trans teen from Guilford, a girl who thinks she's a boy, to share a poem with the crowd. This journalist slammed M.J. Shannon as a politician that couldn't care less about protecting cisgender girls, and a minute later, they told on themselves as a hypocrite by insulting a teenager. As I mentioned, what was the point of referring to him as a girl that thinks he's a boy if it wasn't to delegitimize him as a person? It's not just unnecessary, but it's disrespectful too, because imagine if this teenager or any other transgender youth came across this article. They would think that adjusting their body to match how they feel on the inside is a character flaw, and they'd start to hate themselves, which will do more harm than good for their mental health. It would have been in the Connecticut Centennial's best interest to edit that out, but I wouldn't count on it. Transgender representatives from several organizations offered comments too, including Ace Ricker from Q+, which is a not-for-profit focused on queer youth to make sure they have visibility, Brianna Scarira, an event organizer with Middletown Pride, Julie Walsh of the Triangle Community Center, Tony Ferraolio of Equality Connecticut, and Healthcare Advocates International Youth and Family Program, and Gina Rosich, the chair of the Department of Social Work and Equitable Community Practice at the University of St. Joseph. For the past 18 years, I have had the honor to work with transgender youth and their families, Ferraolio said, and if you want to know what joy looks like, hang out with a little trans kid that finally realizes that it's safe enough to be themselves. Joy comes from hanging out with a little trans kid? God, that journalist is unprofessional. I bet it killed that journalist to type out that passage, let alone ask that question. A child feeling accepted and happy about themselves for being queer and or transgender contradicts the LGBT+ community is grooming our kids' narrative that parental rights activists continue to perpetuate at public hearings and on Meta, where they are free to post about it without getting suspended. That explains why the journalist felt that insulting a trans teenager on newsprint was appropriate to do. It demonstrates that the publication, not M.J. Shannon, doesn't care about a child's welfare if they are not cisgender, heterosexual, or Caucasian. Ferraolio's group, Equality Connecticut, has been advocating for a long list of quote-unquote trans-friendly legislation in Hartford this session, including, and I'll do my best to clarify on the details of the proposed laws as outlined in the bills. The article uses inflammatory language when describing them to convince its readers to oppose them without looking into why these protections are needed and gaining an understanding as to why anti-trans legislation impacts everyone. Furthermore, the wording subjects the affected individuals to harassment both online and real life. SJ35. This is about embedding radical gender and abortion policies into the Connecticut state constitution. There's nothing radical about the transgender and non-binary communities demanding respect and for women to have reproductive rights. What is radical is forcing people to accept your beliefs without allowing them to ask if they're morally right or wrong. I know perfectly well that inevitably in the comments a chauvinist is going to turn the tables and say the same thing about me, but the difference here is I am holding Christine Rebstock and the Connecticut Centinal accountable for advocating against basic human rights and making public places safer environments despite them claiming that they want to accomplish these goals. SJ57. This would amend the state constitution to make it gender neutral. It's exactly what it sounds like. HB 6847. This would add a non-binary gender option to state forms and applications. Right. That way non-binary individuals can apply for a driver's license, passport, or fill out a job application without being asked if they're male or female when they're neither of the above. They would be uncomfortable with filling out these forms if they're not given that option, and the isolation from the limitations that might happen will be disturbing. SB 1271. This is about keeping pornographic materials in libraries and allowing librarians to go after people who complain about such materials. This bill would require schools and libraries to keep challenged books and be transparent about why they're restricted so parents can make informed decisions about what they would allow their children to read. Coincidentally, a bill that would ban online pornography is being considered in the House of Representatives. While it comes across as a measure taken to fight exploitation of vulnerable people, what defines pornography is so ambiguous that it actually gives the federal government leeway to punish protesters and censor works of art/movies that encourage critical thinking. Worst of all, it could make teaching sex education and gender issues a criminal offense, putting teachers and librarians behind bars for possessing books like Captain Underpants and Persepolis, to name a few. If signed into law, neighbors that once got along would turn on each other, and schools and museums would become bleak, colorless environments. One other factor worth mentioning that's related to censorship legislation is that a transphobic state senator from Minnesota, Justin Eichhorn, was arrested in March for attempting to pay a 17-year-old girl for sex. Hours earlier, he proposed a bill that would classify Trump derangement syndrome as a mental illness, which isn't even a legitimate condition. It's basically a tactic to shut down activists the same way Christine tried to shut me down. Justin resigned that Thursday before the Senate debated on voting to have him expelled, and he pleaded not guilty at his arraignment. This is a scandalous situation because, as if a political figure disregarding activists as mentally ill to silence opposing viewpoints and valid concerns about the bills they're drafting is babyish enough, for them to get caught committing the crime they've claimed that the LGBT plus community is doing to kids is 50 times worse. It's infuriating that this grooming narrative continues to be perpetuated nationwide in spite of that charge against Justin. If right-wing politicians are desperate to get these censorship bills signed into law at the state and federal level, including in Connecticut, it's possible that some of them are panicking that their own sins might eventually catch up to them. Not every conservative politician and commentator is a child molester behind closed doors, but a handful of them that made the news for the wrong reasons so far this year fall into that category. SB 1380. This says healthcare providers can't discriminate against people based on gender identity, as they shouldn't, because what sane healthcare provider does that in the first place? I mentioned this before, but if they choose not to see a patient solely based on their gender identity, they shouldn't work in the medical field at all. This is non-negotiable. SB 1530. This would shield providers of chemical and surgical mutilation, aka gender-affirming care services. Describing gender-affirming care as chemical and surgical mutilation is alienating phrasing that feeds into the relentless bullying that trans, intersex, and non-binary individuals regularly receive on social media platforms owned by Meta, X, and sometimes TikTok. It implicates that they are ruining their bodies by having procedures that would help them feel comfortable in their own skin. We don't need that hostility to seep into hospitals too. As long as an individual that received gender-affirming care is happy with the way their bodies turned out, it doesn't matter what these users and lately the federal government say about them. HB 6913. This is about making sure people can use any bathroom they want in long-term care facilities. It requires facilities to use pronouns and more. Up to 12 community colleges in Connecticut have gender-neutral lavatories already. Some of them are single occupancy, which means segregating them by gender is unnecessary anyway. Forcing trans individuals to use the lavatories that don't correspond with their gender identities might actually put them in harm's way, since multiple studies have found that trans women are at greater risk of getting assaulted when they enter male spaces. In 2015, a transgender activist named Michael Hughes protested legislation in Minnesota targeting trans students by tweeting selfies of himself in women's lavatories and asking his followers on X, "Do I honestly look like I belong here?" His campaign went viral and the proposed bills were later tossed out, though discrimination in Texas, where Michael has since moved to, has increased to the point where changing one's gender identity would be classified as a felony in a recently proposed bill. 2 years later, Michael briefly relaunched his We Need to Pee campaign to challenge anti-trans laws in Texas as well. Though it seems like his efforts were fruitless that time, he remained critical of President Trump during his time on X. If you take a look at one of Michael's selfies with the context missing, you can't even tell he's an assigned female at birth. In that case, how would a bathroom ban be enforced if masculine-looking individuals enter women's spaces? If they're going to be asked to drop their pants to prove their gender, that would be an incredibly uncomfortable, invasive experience that would scare them away from using a public bathroom. And that's not all. If a dude that looks feminine or has characteristics that aren't conventional of what is expected of men, like my voice for example, enters the men's room, they're more likely to be assaulted as well, which is why I believe that if HB 6193 is signed into law, it's a step in the right direction toward deconstructing the irrational hatred towards the trans community that the Connecticut General Assembly was forced to put up with earlier this year. I don't think it'll go away entirely, but it's still a step nonetheless. HB 7213. This allows minors to receive abortion services, pregnancy-related treatment, and contraception without their parents' knowledge or consent. Let me spell this out. Along with Christine, the journalist that wrote this article is driven to protect young girls from getting assaulted while playing in sports. But when they do get assaulted and they end up impregnated as a result, then they aren't legally permitted to terminate their pregnancies even if they're not ready for motherhood, and carrying the baby to term would endanger their health. That doesn't sound like protecting young girls if they're being told to obey their potentially controlling parents. That's the problem I have with integrating parental rights into law. That could put children living in abusive, dysfunctional homes at increased risk of violence. As they grow up, that violence is bound to surge, especially if one or both of the parents doesn't have the mental capacity to handle their child having their own autonomy. Many kids that are in these situations are lucky to be raised by supportive parents that can guide them when making decisions about their reproductive health, and as they work through the steps needed to get an abortion, that becomes a huge benefit for their well-being. Then these kids would feel safe confiding in their parents if they feel like they're in danger. The surprise closing guest, Reverend Aaron Miller from MCC Hartford, seems to think Jesus would be okay with trans people flipping over some tables to fight for their rights. I wouldn't say that Jesus would be on board with flipping tables, but essentially he would fully support the LGBT+ community fighting for their rights. It's because he would show them the compassion and tenderness that this journalist is devoid of. He would reassure them that there's nothing wrong with them, and being different doesn't make them any less worthy of God's love. As a matter of fact, Jesus would be labeled as woke because his teachings historically clashed with modern Christian values. If he were alive today, Trump's most dangerous supporters would certainly try to get him crucified for promoting tolerance and devoting his time giving to charities. Meanwhile, Governor Ned Lamont tweeted about Transgender Day of Visibility and got absolutely trashed in the comments because, quite frankly, the trans agenda is a step too far for the majority of the country. On the contrary, according to a Wesleyan poll published on an article in the Connecticut Mirror, voters are alright with Governor Ned Lamont's performance and are in favor of increased spending on programs like municipal and non-profit service providers. Sadly, this article was from 2 years ago, and I believe it's overdue for an update. On the other hand, the heinous, ableist, inhumane replies Governor Lamont got on X do not reflect the opinions of these voters, but they are to be expected if you're using a cesspit of a platform that's seen an increase in hate speech since Elon Musk bought it. Regardless of whether most of these replies are coming from bots or not, if transgender individuals campaigning for the right to exist irritates you, the problem's with you because you're too stuck up and ignorant to understand why large crowds are protesting in major cities. The mainstream media may not be touching on it as much out of fear they'd incur President Trump's wrath, but it's courageous of these protesters to be out on the streets because they love their country more than they fear the administration in charge of it. For the majority of the U.S., what are actually 2 steps too far are tariffs that have made trips to the supermarket more expensive and cuts to Medicaid as well as Social Security. Impoverished individuals and those struggling with addiction to alcohol or substances that rely on both programs will lose coverage. This will lead to an increase in the country's mortality rate because basic necessities would be placed out of reach and hope for recovery would virtually be non-existent. The Connecticut Centinal concluded this article by defaming Governor Lamont over an LGBT+ health workshop hosted by the Anchor Health Initiative that the publication is obsessively depicting to be more provocative than it actually is, because adult toys were used to discuss rectal health and practicing safe sex. I'm not going to show you the actual image or else YouTube won't let this video see the light of day. I'll admit that it was bold and shocking for that workshop to use them, judging from the comment section on this Reddit post about a health teacher at a junior high school that kept an adult toy on her desk. Some schools are beginning to use them in their sex education classes. One user stated that their teacher used one to demonstrate how to properly put on a condom. I've never seen that happen at my high school, but a child development class did exist. I didn't enroll in it, but some of my classmates would sometimes carry baby dolls that randomly cry during study hall, and it annoyed me enough to not want kids anytime soon. Along with learning how to put on a condom, it is a crucial lesson to guide students on preventing unwanted pregnancies and becoming parents before they are emotionally/financially ready to provide for their kids. But the right wing would use these lessons to point fingers at teachers, librarians, and doctors alike and make presumptuous accusations that they are sexualizing children to intimidate their employers into letting them go. I'm shocked that someone proofread this transphobic article and thought, hey, this is a good piece to publish. After reading it, I've learned that Rebstock was correct about 2 things. The article is deliberately offensive to the trans community, and the journalists that wrote it didn't do their due diligence covering the Trans Day of Visibility event. It doesn't overshadow her own horrific, misinformed comments about the trans community, sex education, and disdain for diversity, equity, and inclusion. That's still unacceptable, and I will never condone her comments, but when even she's starting to realize that the Connecticut Centinal can't be trusted to accurately cover sex and gender issues, that shows how close to home this is starting to hit, and I'm heartbroken for marginalized kids living in Connecticut. Anyway, you guys can let me know what you think in the comments below. I'm going to be donating to the Trevor Project again because these kids will need its 24/7 hotline now more than ever. Please do your share as well, but only do so if you can afford it. I always believe every penny helps because even a small donation can leave a huge impact. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in my next video. Bye.